Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So this talk is going to be on migration in Drupal 8. I do appreciate questions and participation. So if anybody has a question, feel free to flag me down and I'll take that question, see if I can answer it. My name is Nick, also known as Nicxvan, Nicxvan. I help organize this camp. I help co-host a semi-weekly podcast called Talking Drupal that you may have heard. And if you have any comments about either this event, my talk, or the podcast, feel free to let me know. So this talk, I wrote a really complex, multilingual, multifaceted migration this year, and I've written several migrations since. And so I'm planning on trying to give an overview of some of the lessons I learned, because there was a lot of Googling and a lot of head scratching that I had to do in order to get the migration working. Once I understood some of the concepts, things went very smoothly, but it took a little bit of work to get there. So hopefully I'll be able to give you guys a roadmap to having your own successful migration. This talk will not be a demo. I realize that most migrations depend specifically on your circumstances, and there are demos online, and I don't think it made sense to kind of do a demo here. So instead I'll be talking about concepts both before you run the migration, how to write the migration, and what a successful migration looks like. So what's the problem? The problem is generally twofold. The first thing is you're trying to migrate content from a pre-existing site to Drupal 8. It's usually in our world we're obviously migrating from another version of Drupal, but you can also migrate from WordPress, Joomla, any other site, except I think if you're trying to migrate from straight HTML, that would be somewhat complex, but I do have a client that actually sort of did that by taking a node that was written, they had a content type that had straight HTML in the body field, and they actually took that and parsed it and migrated that, so that's also possible. Another really common use case is kind of what feeds used to be. So a way to move content from an external source into your site on regular intervals, whether that's weekly, monthly, hourly, or whatnot. But the Migrate API, in my view, has kind of replaced what the feeds module used to do in that respect. And so those are the two main things that the Migrate module is useful for. So there's a couple things you need to consider. One of the first things is where the content is coming from.
Did you have slides?
Why is it not shared?
I think it's.
Oh, yeah.
It's not mirrored.
So, let me.
We had that problem in another session.
Let me go back and start over. That's why I like crowd participation. It would have been a really nice video by the end. There's not a single slide. So, how do I mirror? Does anybody know how to do that with a Mac?
I think it's displays, but not a Mac guy either.
So, would it be under desktop? Or just you said display?
It's under your settings or accessories.
Here we go.
Displays, yeah. There you go.
Arrangement,
Yeah,
mirror.
Arrangement.
How's that? Look at that.
There we go.
Now everything's really small. That's okay. There we go. Present. Can everybody see that? Okay, there we go. And so we'll just go through a couple of these really quickly for the video. Okay, so here's where we were. So there's a couple things you need to consider when deciding whether or not you need to migrate. And one of the first things is, where's the content coming from? So in this talk, I'm going to assume that your content is coming from either a Drupal site, a JSON feed, or a CSV. So like I said, you can import from pretty much any database that's available. You can also scrape HTML and pull that in, but I'm not going to give specific examples about those types. I will give examples on how I wrote a migration from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, as well as migrating stuff. from a CSV. And so, what to do before? So the first thing you need to do is you need to plan. A migration isn't a small task, even if it's a simple one. You need to know where the content is coming from, what the structure looks like. You need to know where it's going to. Seems like pretty obvious stuff. But I think that in order to have a successful migration, it's important to document it in a way that multiple people can review it. In my experience, most complex migrations, there's more than one person working on it. You need to make sure that people are doing it consistently. And the second thing that I find is usually the people writing the migration, whether that's yourself or another developer, you don't necessarily have as much insight into the content as the content editors or the stakeholders have. So documenting it, and I'll talk a little bit about how I choose to document it, but documenting it in this way allows you to show stakeholders and ask intelligent questions. So for example, a question might be, you might have a taxonomy. You need to know when that taxonomy needs to be migrated, because maybe it doesn't always need to be migrated. Maybe it only needs to be migrated when it's on this content type. And if you have it documented well, it's easy to keep that rule and apply it during the migration. And so what I like to do is I usually have a spreadsheet, a Google sheet, or something like that. And the first tab, I just write out a list of every single entity that's on the site. I don't really put any information about fields or anything like that, but I'll literally go through all the content types. I'll go through all the taxonomy vocabularies. I'll go through all the paragraph items if they exist. I'll go through field collections. Anything that's an entity, redirects, I'll write it down. And then I'll make some notes about it. I include things that won't be migrated. Many times older sites will have a bunch of content that's just obsolete, but you want to still document it because maybe somebody forgot about it. When I do this list, I like to do some really kind of high-level things. So for example, content types, I'll very quickly look at it and see how many pieces of content exist for each content type, whether it's been translated. Same thing for taxonomy terms and others. I try to just get a sense of how much it's used, and then I also make a note on whether there's dependencies. So for example, if you have a content type like basic page and the site only has 3 basic pages, I most likely wouldn't write a migration for that, just because it'll almost take you more effort to write that migration than it will just be to copy those 3 pages. However, if that basic page is included on articles as an entity reference on 10,000 pieces of content, then it would make sense to migrate that anyway, because then you can preserve that reference programmatically. The next thing I like to do is I create a tab for each entity. And so as an example, I'll take like the article content type, and then what I do is I write out, I split it into 2 halves. I have the Drupal 7, assuming it's Drupal 7, a Drupal 7 half, or pre-existing site half, and then the new site half. And what I do is I create a list of each field, a couple comments about it, and then whether or not that field is being migrated, and if it is, which field is being migrated to. Because when you're writing a migration, you have to run the migration many times, and you need to go back and double check your work. And if you have these relationships documented, it makes your life a lot easier. Otherwise, you will forget something. Even on simple content types, it's very, very important that you write out every single one. The next thing that I like to write on the entity is when I write out the fields, I like to write out what kind of field types they are. Because another thing that happens is every type of field has a slightly different way of being migrated. And so when I'm writing those migrations, I like to group them together. So if you need to figure out how to migrate a body field, for example, once you figure out how to do that, you can, any long text field type on that content type, you can just very easily copy. If you're, for example, migrating a taxonomy term, you learn how to do the term reference migration. You can then also migrate every other type of term reference on the content type. So it allows you to attack the migration so you're doing similar tasks at the same time, so that you can see each edge case as it's coming in. and it makes it a little bit more efficient and less error prone. So you've planned, you're ready for the migration. What modules do you use? And there are several. There are several all over the place. So in core, there are currently, I think, 6 core modules for migration, although I've personally only used 4 of them. Those are the core Migrate module. There's a Migrate Drupal module, a Migrate Drupal multilingual module, and a Migrate Drupal UI module. I believe there's also a Migrate UI module, although I found it to be somewhat buggy, especially with the Migrate Drupal module enabled. So I didn't actually use that. In Contrib, there are 2 or 3 modules that are probably required for every single migration you write. Those are Migrate Plus, Migrate Tools, and if you're doing a CSV, you need Migrate Source CSV, although that supposedly is moving into core pretty soon. And I'll talk a little bit about what the other 2 modules provide, but they're incredibly useful. And then I would recommend that you write a custom module for this. And if you're not used to custom development, don't be scared. 90% of what you're doing is going to be YAML, which is just going to be mapping what your migration is doing. It's pretty straightforward once you kind of know how it works. And hopefully at the end of this talk, you'll know. And so what the custom module does is you just have an info YAML, which says, this is my module. And it sets the dependencies for those 2 contrib modules just to make sure that they don't get installed. And then you can put all your migration files in the config options Migrate Plus config options folder, and you name them Migrate Plus, Migrate, and then whatever your migration type is. And there's one final thing you need. You need the install module, and what that does, every time you reinstall the module, it basically resets all of the migration. It helps reset all the migrations. And so if you can see here, you have under the config, you have a prefix here, and then under the install, you also have that same prefix here. So basically, it's just a way to have your migration clean up after itself when you want to install it and reinstall it. Okay, so and I'll talk a little bit more about why you kind of need this structure as we get a little further. Core can auto-generate migrations for you. I don't remember off the top of my head, but there's a drush command. You run it, it will look at the existing Drupal 7 database if it's Drupal, and it will take a look at all the views that exist, all the content that exists, and automatically generate all those entities. In my view, it's generally not the most useful thing because many times you're just trying to migrate content, you're not trying to migrate configuration. And anytime you have most migrations for complex sites, you're transforming content, you're changing taxonomies to content types, you're transforming content types to taxonomies, and the automatic generation doesn't quite do that. You can import migration, so you can create the YAML and then you can import it through the UI, just like configuration. So it's configuration, so you can use like drush sim to import it. And you can also use a custom module like we just discussed to manage the migration. I recommend the custom module just because one of the things about the way migration works is every time you make a change, you have to completely remove the migration and re-import it. You can't just make a change and like clear cache. And so if you just import it with configuration management, at least in my experience, if you import it with configuration management, you couldn't make a change to it through the UI. You had to make it in, config sync wherever you store the configuration, and then you'd have to re-import that. But if you have it in a module, you could just uninstall the module, reinstall it, and everything gets kind of taken care of. And I found in rerunning the migration over and over and changing it, that uninstalling the module and reinstalling it was just a little bit cleaner and easier to remember than just importing the configuration. And I also highly recommend that you do script those common tasks, which we'll get to right here. So when you don't use Migrate UI, you need to use Drush. Drush is your friend. There's 4 really common commands you'll run. I call them Mrs., Mr., Ms., and Mim. So Mrs. is a reset. So if you have a migration that's stuck, you run that command, give the migration, and it will reset that process. Roll back after you've run a migration. You want to rerun it just to see it run again. Like you haven't changed anything, you're just trying to rerun it. Rolling it back will delete everything that existed and reset the site. Migration status will give you an idea of how much content needs to be imported. It'll give you reports on what's been run, if any at all, that kind of thing. And mim is the command to actually run the import. And so what I tend to do is write a quick bash script that will, and I'll usually call it like reset or something, and it will roll back the migration, reset it, uninstall the module, clear the cache, reinstall the module, and then run migration status to make sure that everything's been cleaned out so you can start again. And so it takes a process that has 6 or 7 steps and makes it one command, and it takes a minute or 2 depending on the size of the migration. And then once you've confirmed that your changes have been put in, you can run the migration. So let's talk about what a migration itself looks like. As I put here, the anatomy of the migration. So it's a YAML file. The migration itself is a YAML file, and I will show you examples at the end of a bunch of different migrations. Node migrations, paragraph migrations, that kind of thing. There's a section at the top that I think of as metadata. It's like information about the migration itself. You have an ID. You want to make sure that you prefix the migration with something. So if you have a client like RIC, so you're doing a migration for Rhode Island College, you might call every migration RIC, and so it'd be like RIC underscore articles, RIC underscore taxonomy students, or something like that. And so that's the thing that you use in that reset in order to reset all the migrations and then delete all the tables. Label, I believe, is just a nice name for it. It's ID is kind of like a machine name for the migration. Label is just like a human-friendly name. Migration group is another type of machine name you can have. It's a way to easily group migrations. So you can create dependencies. So you can, for example, if you have a node that has a taxonomy on it, you need to migrate the taxonomy first, and then you can migrate the node so that you can attach the taxonomy terms. And so you can create dependencies, which is the next one. So you can basically say, hey, this content type migration depends on this taxonomy term, and then the migration group allows you to run them as one group, so you don't have to remember all 10 or 15 migrations you have. You just say mim group, whatever the name of your group is, and it'll work. And then if you need to, you can also set module dependencies. That's a little bit more advanced than I'm planning on talking about today, but you can actually write custom plugins. So if you have a much more complicated migration, you can set those dependencies here. I think I have 1 or 2 examples further down the line, but that's not something that I use very often. The next piece is so there's 4 sections to a migration that I found. 1 is the metadata, the second is the destination, the third is the source, and the fourth is the process. So the second part is the destination, and this is basically saying where the migration is going to. So most commonly this is an entity. So these, under the examples, you could say this is, the destination is entity node, and so it's entity, whatever entity type it is, and you can also set a default bundle. So you could say, for example, this particular migration is a node, and it's going into article. Or you can say this entity is a user, and there's usually no default bundle, because usually you don't have bundles for users. Or this is a media entity, and it's going to be an image or a video. So you can say, you can set the bundle if you need to, but you can also just say, hey, in this particular migration, I'm only migrating images.
Can I just clarify, these are parts of like one YAML file?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, and like I said, we'll see them put together at the end. Because if I put everything on one slide, it'd be monstrous. The next one will be the source, and this is where you'll say, for example, it's a CSV or JSON file, and depending on the source plugin you're using, and I'll give some specific examples right after this. Depending on the source type, you'll have different attributes. So, for example, with JSON, or URL, you'll have to say where you're pulling from. With CSV, you'll have to give the path to the CSV, for example. And that's right here. So, one of the more common source plugins that I tend to use is URL. So this is saying that it is a URL source. It's going to be over HTTP, and it's going to be JSON. It could be XML, for example. And then the URLs one is just going to be the URLs. So many times in development, I'm using Lando for both sites. I have a Drupal 7 and a Drupal 8 site. And so here you would put the URL to the view that's outputting the JSON specific for your migration, and the Lando URL. And then IDs is the way that the migration knows that it's a unique identifier for each row, so that the migration knows, usually it's like NID or FID or something. So basically it knows, hey, this is a new one, this is a new one, this is a new one. And that's how you identify that. You can have multiple IDs. I found that extremely difficult to configure. So that's one of the reasons why I generally use this method, because you can easily create a view and boil everything down to specifically what you need to show, rather than pulling pieces out of a giant pool of content. If you're using the HTTP and JSON parser, then there's a little bit of extra stuff down here with item selector and fields. So it outputs it as JSON, and so you basically have to say, hey, look under the nodes path, and then node NID for an ID. Each field is something that you will then use later in the process section, which we'll get to.
Is the ID, is that generating an ID for you, or you're getting it from the JSON?
You're identifying the primary key.
Yeah.
In JSON.
It's in the JSON.
So you're identifying the primary key. You can't. Okay, so that's a good question. So here it's identifying a primary key. Whether or not that primary key gets used on the new site is a decision that you have to make. So, for example, on a node, in the process, when we get to it, if you tell it to use the NID, then Drupal 8, when it's running the migration, will use that NID for whatever you're importing. And it's actually interesting because this is one of the only times you can do that. So if you have an existing node with an NID and you tell Drupal when it's migrating to use this NID, it will overwrite whatever you had there and create a new. And this is something that you can't even do through the UI. So if you are on somebody who's working on the site, they created a basic page, it's NID 1. Somebody runs a migration and says, hey, use the NID 1, and it's an article. NID 1 will now be an article. It'll overwrite it. And that's an architecture decision. So if the main decision point there, that's a really good question actually. The main decision point there and whether or not you want to keep it, I think, is dependent on whether or not the new site will have existing content before you run the migration. Because if there's existing content, you can't use it because it will overwrite it. Whether it's taxonomy, node, paragraph, anything, it will overwrite any ID. The other consideration is if you have a completely fresh site, it's better to keep it because it's much easier to do entity references when you keep the same thing, because then you don't even have to do a lookup. You can just say, hey, this taxonomy term was 72 there, it's going to be 72 here, just keep 72. But if you're using new ones, you basically have to tell the migration, hey, it was 72 here, but you created a new one. What is it here? And then it will look up and tell you, oh, 72 is now 695. Good question. So the fields have 3 attributes. One is name. Name is, that should have an underscore. It is generally a machine type of machine name. It's used in your migration to reference later on. It's just it's a convenience. So instead of having to use /node NID every time you want to reference NID, you could just, whatever you use in name you can use, which would be NID or name or something else. Label is a nice, pretty name for yourself. I always put it there. I don't know if it's actually required or not. Here's a second source example. So if you're using a CSV, you're using the plugin CSV, you need the attribute for path. It tells you where the migration is, where the CSV is that you're migrating from. You need to define whether or not you have labels in the header or not. And if you do, instead of IDs, you use keys. And the key, you basically do a key value name for the IDs and column names. And so instead of fields, you have column names. It's very similar syntax, pretty straightforward. There's a lot of examples. But these are just two different examples of how, two different sources. And you can use, in one global migration, you can use as many of each as you need. So a good example here is, I had a client that had an entity that wasn't plugged into views well enough to, in a way that didn't make sense to export it as JSON, but it was very easy to get a CSV. They had a custom module that actually generated a CSV, so I just downloaded the CSV and used that. Okay, and then the final of the 4 sections is the process section. I'm sure there's a word for that, but I call them sections. Process is kind of where the magic happens. This is where you kind of do the field mapping. This is where you kind of do transformations. So if you had a field, for example, on the old site called, help text, and now it's going to be a new field called help, you would just assign it, and this is where that kind of happens. Did you have a question? Okay, so there are a lot of process plugins. Core provides most of them, and some of the contrib modules I mentioned provide the other ones. So this is just a big list, and there's a couple links at the end that will show you how to find these. I spent a lot of time on this Drupal.org page looking at them and scratching my head. This is the full list. They're kind of straightforward what they do. The ones that are bolded, I will give specific examples of each of them and talk about how they work, and hopefully that will give you some insight into how to write your own migration. And so as you can see, we'll go over 6 or 8 of them. And then Migrate Plus also provides some plugins. So there's a couple plugins that the core Migrate module doesn't do that are really useful. Like, the core has skip on empty, but if there's an empty field, you can say, hey, skip this row, do something else. But there's no way to say, hey, if this value is X, skip it. And so the Migrate Plus module provides a plugin to do that, as well as like entity lookup and a few other things, string replace. Okay, back to the anatomy. You can access attributes on a field. So for example, if you have a body field, if you've ever looked at it under devel, you usually see something like field underscore body, und, 0, and then you see like value format, and there's a third one, I think, safe value. You can access those in a migration, and this is the format to do that. So if you need to access an attribute that's on a field, you write the field name / attribute. So if you need to, for example, set the value for the body field, you do field underscore body / value. If you needed to set the format for it, it would be field body / format. It's fine. Another really important thing is you can create variables in a migration. So many times when you're writing migration, you need to look up some content. So say, for example, you have on the old site, you have a bunch of fields. Those fields now belong in a paragraph because they're associated directly. You have to write a migration that will create that paragraph, and then you have to do a lookup to find a list of all the paragraphs that now belong on this piece of content. And so what you do is you create a variable to hold that array, and you just create that just by essentially creating a field that doesn't exist, and then you can access that variable by using the whatever variable name that you set. And again, we'll see examples of all the stuff I'm mentioning. And these slides will be up on the website. I don't expect people to memorize this. I'm just hoping to kind of light the way, and then you can always look up the slides later. Or if you're writing a migration later, you can always give me a call, and we can discuss it. And another thing that seemed obvious in the beginning, but I found had a little trouble, you can actually chain migrations. So if you need to do one thing and then another thing and then another thing, you can just run them right after the other. So, and we'll see some examples of that as well. So let's look at some plugins. Any questions? Okay, so let's look at some specific process plugins. So set as a default, or default value is useful when you need to set a default. It's kind of straightforward, but this is an example of what it looks like. So for field body format, many times you always know what the format is. So rather than having to put it in a view or look it up, you can just say, hey, the default value is going to be basic HTML, and then it will set it. It's also useful if, for example, between sites you change format, the name of the format, and you know that, okay, on all the new stuff it's going to be basic HTML, and that didn't even exist on the old one. You can just set that default. It's also useful for authors, things like that. Explode, again, works kind of the way that you expect. It's a good way to separate multi-value fields and process them individually. So this is an example. So say you have this is you're feeding into the field taxonomy. You're exploding it, you're delimiting it by a comma and a space, and source. So this field underscore source is the name of the field on the source plugin previously. So if we just go back really quick, if you're looking here under fields, we have name used elsewhere. The source is whatever is set up in name right here. And so this name corresponds to this source value right here. And that's how you tie them together. And so what this would do is, on the old site, you have a taxonomy field, and it's outputting, and it says, red, orange, blue. This will allow you to split it up into 3 separate values, and then you can do a lookup and say, oh, okay, orange is taxonomy ID 72. And then you can join them back together and put them in field taxonomy later. Extract. This is another one that you're going to get familiar with. So extract is a way, when you do a lookup and you use a temporary ID, it generates an array behind the scenes. So extract is a way to pull that out. So this is a good example. The ID will be index 0, and the revision ID will be index 1. And we'll see more of that with paragraphs. So whenever you create a paragraph, you always get an ID and a revision ID, and you need to set both of those in the field, or it's not going to display properly. You'll get a lot of really weird behavior. And so extract is a way to say, hey, you've looked up this paragraph, I know I want paragraph ID 72, but the way that it actually stores in the database, you need to pull this information out, and then it'll display correctly. Migration lookup. This is probably the single most useful process plugin. Again, it's very straightforward. It's basically a way to do a lookup on a previous migration that has run, most commonly with entity references, and it will allow you to do a key value replacement. So again, if you had a taxonomy of colors and you're passing in something orange, it can do a lookup on that taxonomy migration previously and give you the new ID. You'll see down here, no stub. So this kind of goes back to your question too. If you're running a migration, it's an entity field. It'll generate a fake an empty entity to take that place. No stub basically says, hey, I want you to put something here, but if it doesn't exist, don't generate an empty one. Because sometimes you just need a placeholder, and then you'll come back and do some cleanup. Skip on empty. Again, this is another. I think they did a pretty good job naming these. They're pretty straightforward. But it's a good way if you're importing. You have 10,000 nodes, 8,000 of them have a body field, and 2,000 of them don't. This is a way to just skip, and you're, for example, you're converting the body field to a paragraph. So you don't want to create a paragraph that's just empty, that's useless. Skip on empty is good because it will look at that, it'll say, oh, this is empty, we're not going to create a paragraph for this one. And then going back to this one, when it does a migration lookup and it doesn't find any, it will have a, an NID, but it doesn't find a paragraph, it won't create a stub. And so that's a way to clean up data as you're migrating it over. Static map is kind of like a string replace. It's a good way. It's an easy way to do a key value replacement. I found it really useful for languages because Drupal 7, for example, it stores languages with the two-letter language code, so like EN, ES. It's almost impossible to get Drupal to output that as in like views. It outputs Spanish, English, German. And so with static map, it's really easy just to say, hey, if it says Spanish, it should be ES. If it says English, it should be EN. If it says nothing, for example here, it should be English. And so it's just a really easy way to map. If you have a, for example, if you had a drop-down list and you were changing the keys to a new set of keys, this would be a good way to do that too. Subprocess. This was probably one of the more confusing ones, but it's also really important. It's a way to loop through a list a second time. If you need to compile a list of items, essentially, this will make more sense, I think, when we see more concrete examples. But if you needed to compile a list of different items, for example, you had 4 paragraphs that were being migrated from various places into one piece of content, you join them together. Subprocess is a way to then make them into a multi-value field on the new content type. It's incredible. It took a fair amount of effort to understand exactly what this was doing, but it's basically just iterating itself over itself as many times as it needs to. Multiple values. So again, this is an example of using variables as well. So essentially, looking at this, the old site had a description field, the old site had a body field, the new site has a paragraph reference field that holds a paragraph for the description and the body. And so you would run a migration that would create a paragraph for the description, run a migration that would create a paragraph for the body. Then you would have those 2 variables to do that lookup to find the IDs for them. And then this multiple values thing joins those 2 together. And then the subprocess one we just saw then pulls out the target ID and revision ID from those. So the subprocess basically goes, okay, how many do I have for this individual row? I have 3, I have 4, and then for each one, I need to pull out index 0 and index 1 for the revision and the ID. And so it joins them, so multiple values joins them together, and then subprocess loops over it as many times as it needs to process it. Skip on value. This is one that I used a couple times because sometimes when you're creating the source, it's difficult to actually output an empty field, and the migration just fails if there's nothing there. Like, it needs to have a value. I found this was somewhat rare, but it happened often enough that I thought it was worth putting in here. Generally, I would recommend using the skip on empty, but if you find that you're getting kind of inconsistent results with that, look at finding a way to output something and then just skip on that specific instance. I found it got around a couple of edge cases. You can see the source was an FID field. I found it specifically with files and images. Sometimes just having no value there just didn't work. So having this was a nice workaround.
Excuse me, does that mean with that one, it would skip just one field? Because the empty would skip a whole lot?
Okay, that's a good question. Both of them can do 2 things. So see under method, So method here says process. If we go back to the skip on empty, the method says row. So that's something you define. So skip on row basically says, hey, you're importing this NID 72, right? If this is empty, skip the whole thing. Just forget that you're doing anything. However, skip with the method process, it's kind of the opposite. Instead of skipping the whole thing, it's going to say, just skip this particular field, what you're doing, and keep saving it. So I think an easy way to think about it is, I've mentioned a couple of times converting some fields on an old content type to a paragraph. So if you're converting, say, the body field on an old site to a paragraph, when the migration is happening, if the body field is empty, you don't want to create the paragraph. So you want to just skip that whole thing. However, if you were just migrating that whole piece of content and you looked at it, you just wouldn't want to migrate that field because the field's empty, but you still want to migrate everything else on the content type. And so that's all it is. Does that answer your question? Or okay, very good. But yeah, the only difference between skip on empty and skip on value is skip on empty. I remember why. Okay, so skip on empty is when the field doesn't exist. Skip on value I used when the field would exist but would give output a null. So I found there was a couple cases where the source, when it was empty, instead of just not existing, would show null, or it would fail if it just didn't exist. And so I would say, hey, if it's null, I'll put the word empty and skip it then. It's a bit of a workaround, but it came up a couple times. Okay. So as usual, I'm going through. I was worried I would talk far too long. I'm going through these a little bit faster than I expected. So the next thing is I'm going to show some actual migrations that were written. They were just sanitized, so I changed, where they were pointing to. After that, I can show you some of the resources and then answer any questions that you might have. So if anybody happened to look up how to zoom in, now would be a good time. How do you zoom in?
Go to the system preferences.
Okay. So this is also a talk on how to use an Apple, how to use a Mac. System preferences, and then what?
And then click on accessibility.
Oh, I should have known it was an accessibility feature.
And then under Zoom, on the left-hand panel, you can check the top box.
What is that? Is that shift or function?
I think that's option.
No, this one is the option, the one to the left.
Option and command.
Oh, I see, sorry. Okay. Option command 8 zooms in. Option command 8. Oh, that's awesome. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to spend way too much time next week doing that. Okay, so let's see how it doesn't work when I'm in preview, so, or present rather. Oh no, I was hitting the wrong keys. There we go. But it only goes, okay. We're all learning together. Okay, so this is a node migration. Okay, sorry.
Oh, your Zoom style? So in that same panel, if you go into your Zoom style, there's picture in picture. The default is full screen.
Oh, okay. We'll make one more change on the fly. We have time. Don't worry. I learn something new every year when I present.
So down at the bottom, that drop down, yeah.
Thanks. And so let's see how that works. Oh, that's even better. Awesome.
So the only way I find out to get out of that is do option command the opposite of making it equals, makes it smaller.
Okay. Okay. one last question. Is there a way to make that box bigger?
I was trying to do that.
Okay. Okay. So, okay, so this is a node migration. It's very simple. I'm just migrating the title. So you can see here, the ID is prefix underscore node. So if you remember all the way back in the beginning, the install file basically had a DB query to delete tables. So when you create a migration, it creates several tables. One of the, for each migration that you run, that you create actually. One is the messages table, and one is a mapping table. So the messages table is useful for errors. So if a migration fails, it'll put something in the messages table. The mapping one is the thing when you do a migration lookup. So it says, hey, the ID over here was 32, and on the new site, it's whatever it is, whether you're using it again or you're creating a new entity. And so that's what's used in the migration lookup. And so when you uninstall and reinstall, that DB query looks for any table that has that prefix value and then just drops the table. So it's just a cleanup mechanism. It'll make your life easier. Make sure you prefix everything. The next thing is the label. Like I said, it's just import article from Drupal. So that's just a developer friendly name. I don't even think it's required, but I always kept it there. Migration group, I always just named it after the custom module. And then the dependency I set to the custom module that I created, so that way Drupal, let me see if there's...
That label shows up in the UI, doesn't it?
I think it does, but again, I don't install that UI module, so... Oh, now I just lost my mouse. It's not happy with... Okay, there we go. That was interesting. Let me see. I think it's just a little bit too hard to read when I...
Click options, I think. Next to
Hold to temporarily
adjust
toggle.
size and location. The button at the very bottom. Just turn right.
This is really cool. I forget what I learned last year. I think I learned how to shut off my notifications. Okay, so let's see. Hopefully this will make it a little bit more pleasant for you guys. Look at that. Okay. Okay, so, and remember again, we have 4 sections to the migration. So this is all the metadata up here. It's got the ID, the label, the group, the dependencies. Then we have the destination right here, which many times is very short, like this is a node entity, and we're defaulting to article. Then we have the source, which in this case is URL. It's going to be HTTP fetcher, and it's going to look for JSON. And it's looking at this local.lando site JSON/nodes for that JSON. And IDs, we're going to use NID as our primary key, or our unique identifier rather, and it's an integer. You don't always need the type, but I keep it there just because sometimes you do, and rather than try to debug when you do and when you don't, it doesn't hurt to have it. And then the item selector is the parent level that the view outputs, and then the fields are just a couple of fields that you put. So I have, in this case, I have an NID field, and I have a title field. And then we have, I zoomed in on, there we go. Into report copyright infringement. No. The zoom is interfering with the bottom left-hand corner. I mean the slides. And then we have the process. In this case, it's just the title. But going back to your question yet again, if I were to say there NID : NID, it would enforce the NID from the source on the destination. And so you can see here when I'm referencing the title, I'm just using whatever values in the name field.
But either way, the watermark should still work.
Watermark?
Like if you're importing new data,
Yeah.
you're running the migration again,
Mhm.
it won't start from the beginning, it'll just give you whatever that data is.
Yep. Okay, this is, I'll go a little bit quicker on this one because it's basically the same thing. The only difference is the destination plugin is now a taxonomy term entity rather than node, and then the default bundle is whatever vocabulary you're migrating to. This is all the same except it's a different endpoint. You can, and if you're going Drupal 8 to Drupal 8, you can actually use JSON API module, and that'll actually make a lot of this stuff pretty much out of the box. But if you need to, on Drupal, if it's Drupal 7, I just used JSON views and just created a view that output the information I needed. It's pretty straightforward. The item selector changed because it's a different entity type, so the root is terms, and then obviously the ID is now TID. And I am I'm just importing the name. I don't know why that keeps, I think it's because it's mirrored. Yeah. This is a user example, so this is where it's just a little bit different. A lot of the stuff is the same. You know, the destination is now just a user. There's no default bundle because users generally don't have bundles. But I wanted to point out a couple of different things. One is this hash. So there's a views password. So there's a really cool thing in the Migrate API that it will take a Drupal 7 hash for the password, and it will do some magic on the Drupal 8 side. So the first time somebody logs in, it will hash it the same way Drupal 7 did and allow them to log in with the same password, and then it will rehash it with whatever system you have set up in Drupal 8. So it makes it really, really easy to set up. And then in Drupal 7, there's a module called views password, which will output the hash so that you can pull it in. Obviously, you want to be aware of security implications, but generally, a hash is, it's not the password; it's just a hash. But it works. The next thing I wanted to point out. You can see here, many times, even if you don't enforce IDs for nodes, taxonomy terms, and everything else, you probably need to do that for users because many times user IDs are tied to many other things, and so this is a way to do that. A couple other really quick things I want to point out. If you migrate users, make sure you migrate the status because by default, Migrate will block every user it migrates, which is probably a good practice, but also, you don't want to have every single user migrated blocked. So make sure you check that out. I ran into that issue when I was testing migration. I created a new user on the old site, created a password that I knew, migrated the user, tried to log in, and wasn't able to log in. Like, what the heck is not working? And then realized every user was blocked because it blocks everybody by default. So make sure you migrate that. The second thing I wanted to point out is this field gender. So this is an example of how you can actually step outside some of the examples that I gave. This particular case, the old site, the gender was male or female, but they were capitalized, the keys were capitalized, and on the new site, the keys were not capitalized. And so you can also just use the callback plugin, and then you can call pretty much any Drupal method that's available. So you can just call the Unicode string to lower on that field, and it will enforce lowercase. And so pretty much anything that's available in Drupal, if you need to run a function, you can grab it like this, and it's pretty nice. Any questions so far? The next examples start to get a little bit deeper.
Are there hyphens between the fields necessary, or is that?
That's YAML, so it's a way to it's a way to create an array in YAML. There's actually two ways you can do it. I forget the other way, but I found this way easier to maintain. And I think this way is also how Drupal, when you export config, I think this is how Drupal generates it. Don't quote me on that. But you do have to have something like that. Like there's this format or something else. That's not enforced by Migrate, that's enforced by the YAML spec. Okay, this is how you migrate a file. So again, over here I'm using a source plugin URL and JSON. There's something new here though called constants. So you can actually create constants if you want to. In this case, it's where we're going to store the files. So it's the URI to the public folder. And then there's a file source and destination process plugin. So the source is basically the path on the other site. The destination, I concatenate the file name and the destination from the constants. And then I URL encode it because it's something that needs to be encoded. And so that provides a string on where you want to copy the file to. And then I use file copy to actually copy the file over. And then finally I use the default value to make it available. So it's pretty straightforward. And again, these are, except for renaming fields and things, these are real world examples that work. So you can always take a look at the slide deck once I publish it, if you're trying to migrate an image field, for example. This is a media entity. So this is a good example of the first time that you'll need to chain a migration. So whenever you migrate an entity that points at an entity, you need to migrate the sub-entity first. So this is a this is a media image entity, and so you can see right here, the plugin is entity media, and the default bundle is image. And it has a dependency on the file migration, which is the one we just looked at. And so what will happen is Migrate will create the file entity, generate the FID, copy the file over, and then this migration will do a lookup on that migration using the FID, find the new FID, and then set that on the image field, which right here, remember we had, if you have an attribute on a field, like target ID, it'll set it right there. So what this is doing is saying, hey, this media entity has a field media image _1, and we want the target ID on that field to be set to whatever value this FID was from migration prefix image. And then this is just saying the alt text on that. So it's a separate column, but it's a value that alt is coming from up here, and the FID is coming from here. Any questions? I see a couple people that look like they want to be scratching their heads. No?
So if you run this migration and you haven't done the prefix file yet, it'll just complain and say you haven't run that migration yet.
Honestly, I'm not sure. So we have this right here where it says migration dependencies require prefix file. I'm not sure if it will complain or if it will just automatically, I think it will just automatically run the dependent migration first. The really nice thing about all these dependencies is, especially with a more complex site, you might end up with 15 or 20 or 30 migrations. And when you put them all in a group, you can basically just say, hey, run this migration group, and it will figure out which one needs to run first and just run them and go through. So you almost don't have to worry. As long as you know, hey, this one has this dependency and set it, it'll remember that for you. Okay, so let's try to get through a couple more of these a little bit quicker. So the next one, this is a paragraph example. And this is also using the static map. And so here, this one is slightly different. So the plugin, like almost every other plugin, is just entity : whatever it is. paragraphs are special, so they're actually entity reference revisions paragraph, and then you set whatever bundle you want, and then this is the static map to set the language to English, Spanish, or English. And then this is checking, again, that body value and skipping it if it's not available. And then setting the format to basic HTML. Okay, I keep thinking that hitting escape is going to get rid of this. So, how many people here have used paragraphs in Drupal 8? Okay, looks like most of you. So you're aware that you create the paragraph, that's the entity, but then you also have to create the paragraph container field that actually holds the paragraph. So whenever you create a paragraph migration, you also have to write that secondary migration to actually put it in the field. And this is a good example of how that works. So this is actually a paragraph that holds a paragraph. I find nobody really writes just flat paragraphs. They write paragraphs that contain paragraphs that contain paragraphs. So this is actually one that is contained, so you can kind of see both ways. And so this is the wrong slide. This one right here. That's why it was confusing me. So this right here is when you're going to use a variable. So what this is doing is skipping if it's empty, and then doing a migration lookup. That creates a temporary variable with a list of all the lookups that it should have. This is the paragraph container field that is the entity reference field to the child paragraph. And then the sub-process just loops through that variable in order to assign the paragraph that it looked up. And so this is how you create a nested paragraph. Got a question? You look like you have a question. No?
No, it's not quite sinking in, that's all. I don't know. That part of it's just getting by for the moment.
Okay, so then 2 more slides, and then we can go back and look at any of those that you want to in more depth. This is, I just want to very briefly look at this one. This is a translation, what it looks like for a translation. So paragraphs are entities, so you need to migrate the source language first, and then you migrate the translated language, and then you associate them with each other. And so that's done right here. So this does a lookup against the translation ID. And then this is a case where you will assign the ID manually, even if you're generating new IDs. So what this is basically doing is looking up the previously created entity and then assigning the same one and assigning the new revision ID with the new translated piece of content. And then I wanted to show one last thing. The 2 other things that I found were incredibly difficult were if you're joining content together, like multiple paragraphs, for example, to one field, you have to take a slightly different tactic if some of those values might be empty versus none of them will be empty. There's no one size fits all. So I won't go into particular detail, but if you're merging multiple fields and some of them are empty, you need to take this tactic on the left, which basically does an array filter to get rid of the empty values before setting them. If you have multiple fields being merged into one and they're all populated, then you basically just do a sub-process, and you can't invert those. That's something you need to know whether your source is going to have empty values or not. and use one or the other accordingly.
Sorry, what's the difference between the left one and the right?
So the left one is when you're merging multiple values into one field, and some of those values might be empty.
Okay.
And the right-hand side is when you need to merge multiple fields into one, and none of the sources are empty. And then these are the resources. So this is the core process plugins, and so I listed these in the slides, but you can get. Oh, that's a new one actually. This must have just been updated. But they're right here, so you can see some examples like this. These are all the attributes that you need. It's pretty straightforward. And then on the right-hand side, you can also get to the process plugins for Migrate Plus. And so there's a lot of documentation, and it's generally pretty good. And then you can see constants here. And does anybody have any questions? Is there a slide somebody wanted to look at again?
So I noticed, so I'm assuming part of your process is, if it states a D7 site, building a bunch of views on the D7 site to give you the nodes or the users or whatever that you want, correct?
Yeah. So you can connect directly to the database, but I've found that if you do that, it generally makes assumptions about what is being moved to where. But you can connect directly to the database.
Okay. And you just, based on your experience, it's just easier to just pull out just the data you want versus trying to,
Yeah, and I think the reason why is because, especially for these particular examples, the client was converting some content types to taxonomies. They were converting a bunch of fields to paragraphs. They were and they were transforming a bunch of stuff based on what values were in there. So it wasn't like I couldn't just connect to content type A and migrate that content over. I had to take content type A and then look at this subset of the content type A and say, take these ones and put them here, take these other ones and put them there. So I found it easier just to create the view and say, hey, this view is going to pull these values and create this set of content, and this set is going to come over here. So if you're just migrating content directly, and you know like all content A is going to be content X over here, then it's probably easier just to connect directly to the database. And so then the source will be slightly different. So I haven't had it yet, but basically you would do, I think it's source database or something, and then you just create a new database array in the settings.php and point it at the...
I think you have to tell it if it's a D7 or D6 or...
Oh, it can be straight SQL too. It doesn't even have to be a Drupal site. But yeah, that's essentially what it is.
But I believe if you tell it it's D7, it knows what fields are...
Yeah.
So it knows how to put together the node and connect to the different field tables.
Yeah. And like I said, it was when I tried... Because if you do that, you can also run an automated generation, and it will give you most of the YAML files to start with. But I found that it basically assumes you want the same site that you had in D7 and D8. And so I found it would be more effort to go through those generated files and update them to match what I needed than just to build a view with the information I needed and write the migration from scratch.
I suppose it's situational, I suppose, depending on if you're coming from a good D7 site that was built the way, similar to what you want versus coming from maybe an older site where you need to change things.
Yeah, I mean, I would say even a good D7 site, when's the last time somebody built a straight D7 site? It's been at least 3-4 years now, right? And so most people if it was in the last 3 years, usually people aren't looking to migrate to Drupal 8 yet. They're looking to get some more mileage. So most people that are migrating are 4 or 5 years old. So even if it was built well then, things like paragraphs didn't even exist 4 years ago. So it was top of the line then, but it doesn't quite match the new architecture.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I might have missed it at the beginning. Is the process to, like your themes, like all your front end stuff, do you just build that first in D8 and then you're talking about moving the database and data content as a second part of migration, or are you doing the data and then building new front ends to that?
It depends, but usually writing the theme first. But I'm actually way over in time, so I'm going to push the